Assalamu alaikum everyone. Good evening and thank you so much for the very generous introduction, to Hassan and the Muslim Institute for extending an invitation to me to speak here today, and for putting together such a fantastic weekend of talks and discussions which have been enriching to listen to. I'm just going to quickly disclaimer with I picked up a horrible cold on the journey down, and so if I'm relying on my notes, it's just because my brain's a bit foggy right now. So although I can't claim to be anywhere near as accomplished as the speakers that have preceded me, or indeed those that are to come tomorrow, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion here today. So as mentioned, I'll be discussing and looking to the past in order to look to the future. I'm going to put a quick disclaimer in here, which I often try and include before looking at history, which is quite often when people look back, particularly at movements, there's a tendency to highlight areas where activists and organisers of past perhaps made missteps. I don't intend any of the trends or the machinations of the state we discussed today as an attack or any malice on my part towards the movements or the individuals in them. Indeed, many of the trends that we'll discuss continue to this day. Just to say, I mainly highlighted that so as not to infer any offence on anyone, but also as a reminder to myself that in 40 or 50 years' time, hopefully people will be looking back at the organising taking place today and drawing out critical lessons for their time too. I'm also hoping this discussion acts as a bit of a bridge between the fantastic discussions we've had so far, which have highlighted the situation in Palestine and of Palestinian refugees and in Lebanon, and the discussions that we're going to be having today on looking into history for lessons to take ahead will hopefully be of assistance for the discussions tomorrow on how we build solidarity, how we organise, what organisational forms that can take, and how we move ahead. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to be splitting my talk in three parts. So the first will be looking at the rise of Black Power movements in Britain, the second on the breaking of a movement, which looks at the way the state responded to the shows of strength in 1981, and finally towards anti-racism, where we'll highlight the key pillars and principles we should hold when moving ahead. So firstly, on the rise of Black Power, and I'm sure in front of such an esteemed audience, there'll be many opinions and events that we can pull on, but does anyone remember any of the sort of major incidents of the 60s and 70s, key events, historical strikes, or anything that's often associated with Black Power movements?
Cable Street?
Yeah, going back a bit before that, but yeah, Cable Street.
Demonstration after the Deptford fires, 1981.
1981, yes, the Black People's Day of Action. Yeah, we'll be talking about that.
Brixton riots.
Brixton riots, yeah, 1981.
And the fact that I was beaten up by black shirts.
Yeah.
What about after Bali in East London?
Al-Tabali? Yeah, the demonstrations and...
He was killed, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, after the murder of Al-Tabali.
Most famous of all, Bradford 12.
Bradford 12, that'll be in today.
Indian women strike, the workers strike.
Oh, the female, yeah, the factory strike.
Grundwick strikes.
Yes.
77.
Yeah. Amazing. So...
The visit of Malcolm X.
Yes.
Hosted by one of our fellows who's here today.
Dr. Saviki.
Amazing.
Sheffield University.
When was that?
64.
In Paul's speech, you know?
Yes, yeah. We're just a slight warning. We will be hearing a little bit from Enoch Powell later on in the presentation. So, defining Black Power in Britain. Black Power in Britain is often defined as a form of radical political organising among African, Asian, and Caribbean communities from sort of 67 to 81, emphasising the autonomy and independence particularly from the institutions of mainstream British politics, influenced by US Black Power, socialism and third world liberation struggles, and really that radical internationalism and those key links to struggles worldwide is something we'll be coming back to throughout. So Black Power was not simply opposition to racism, and often defined as anti-racism, but struggles for community self-determination and specifically social transformation. So I'm going to see if this hopefully...
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. We must be mad, literally mad as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
So some Enoch Powell there just to ruin our evenings. So when we go into this era of Black Power, this is when the dynamics of race, class and citizenship collided in the late 1960s as the post-war settlement of social democracy, the welfare state, entered a period of terminal crisis that would make way for the emergence of neoliberalism. As the crisis, two parallel political lines emerged which offered two very different visions of what Britain could become. On the one hand was the rise of powerlism, a deeply reactionary strain of white English nationalism that sought the end of immigration to Britain. Powerlism shot to national attention in April '68 when then Tory cabinet member Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham. Powell's incendiary address, haunted by fever dreams of a Britain being colonised by the darker races, struck a chord across the country. It provided the intellectual scaffolding for what would be known as Britain's New Right through the 70s, which eventually consolidated power with the rise of Thatcher's Conservative government in 1979. On the other hand, the birth of Britain's Black Power era was marked by the formation of the Universal Coloured People's Association, the UCPA, in 1967, and a constellation of groups, formations and campaigns that followed it. This era heralded the radicalisation of African, Caribbean and Asian communities in Britain, who had long been excluded from the fruits of the post-war settlement, despite comprising the labour force that underwrote it, and produced the most vibrant period of anti-racism in Britain's modern history. Black Power emerged as a response to the growing racism in British society, but more significantly, it was the political expression of the most alienated sections of post-war Britain, of those who had been incorporated into the very bottom of its working class, its racial hierarchy of Britishness, and who had been excluded from the institutions of British society. Black Power represented both a political rupture and a generational break. The '67 visit of US Trinidadian Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, to speak at the London Dialectics of Liberation Conference inaugurated Black Power in movement, resulting in the formation of the CPA and an array of organisations subsequently, such as the British Panther Movement, Black Unity and Freedom Party, the Black Workers Movement, Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, Black Liberation Front, Today Ours, the Black People's Alliance, the Asian Youth Movements, the Fasimbas, and countless others. The work taken by these groups was diverse, and the priorities of specific groups operating under the banner of Black Power reflected their own particular encounters with British racism. For Africans and Caribbeans, this often centred on countering police violence and police attacks on African Caribbean social spaces. African and Caribbean women often led on those defence campaigns for individuals targeted by the forces of law and order, as well as alternative or supplementary schooling programmes. African, Caribbean and Asian women organised around the issues of family and reproductive justice, such as experimental use of the Depo-Provera contraceptive on African Caribbean women. Asians at large confronted anti-migrant powers, while Indians in particular were remarked upon as being the most militant sector of the labour force, with longer established organisations like the various Indian worker associations engaging in action against racist employers. Meanwhile, Bangladeshi political action centred on self-defence against racist attacks, as well as a very powerful squatters movement in East London. As a youthful movement, it largely comprised second-generation Commonwealth migrants, or rather first-generation citizens of the British state, signalling a departure from the more moderate and conciliatory anti-racism led by Middle Saxons of the previous generation. These had taken the form of various immigrant and welfare associations that had ossified into semi-appendages of local government in order to manage migrant population. They also included institutions like the local community relations commissions set up under the Race Relations Act 68, where migrants and white liberals worked together alongside local government representatives and police. This new assertiveness was captured in a 1978 journal entry by Pratibha Parmar, then an activist in the Bradford Black Collective, reporting on a national demonstration against immigration laws. The time has long gone when the blacks in Britain could afford to make pleas to the British government that it honour its moral obligations to us and grant us our full rights. We should not be fighting a moral crusade, begging to be allowed to live as equal citizens. This is from Black Britannica, a 1978 documentary, which I think Hassan said was Linton Kwesi Johnson's. And the speaker is Ambalavana Sivanandan, the former director of the Institute of Race Relations, one of the preeminent scholars of that era, who's describing the mood of the new era of the youth organising in this period.
The siege might have made, how mistaken it was to be able to, what they said was that they want to get monies to service the black community, the struggles of the black community. That is why they held up the Spaghetti House. They didn't want to thieve Spaghetti House for their own pockets, to line their own pockets. What motivated them was the impossibility of living in this society with any sort of dignity, with any sort of family life, and be marked out as a section of the community which was totally undesirable, unwanted, rejected. That is the significance of the Spaghetti House siege. And that is only a part and parcel of the things that black youth have been saying. They have been saying in effect, they may not articulate it in these terms, they have been saying in effect, look, you want to reproduce the sub-proletariat that you imported into this country in our father's time. You now want to reproduce that same sub-proletariat and make us do the shit work that our parents did. And all that we can say to you is get stuffed, fuck you, we're not going to do that.
So that's Sivanandan sort of summarising the mood of that era of youth who were organising under Black Power at the time, and the forms of organising and the various spheres within which the organising took place was across all spheres, effectively. So Black Power encompassed the struggles of people who were subject to social, economic and political disenfranchisement, and the subjective and objective factors inspired a break from past forms of organising pre-67. But this is Nurul Huq in East London.
Despite the scepticism of many older Bengalis, the signs are that the community will increasingly take matters into its own hands in future. Nurul Huq believes that his fellow Muslims are being shaken out of their traditional attitudes.
They have changed. If you attack a youth of our community, you get the answer. There's no doubt about it. We make it crystal clear that we will not tolerate that nonsense. We are the rightful citizens of this country. We are not sheep deserters. We have not come here unlawfully. We have come here as a legacy of imperialism. We have come here legally, and we have been accepted by the ordinary people of this country. So we have nothing to fear if nobody gives you freedom. You have to fight for it. Nobody fights for you. You have to fight for yourselves. So we have accepted this lesson.
And so that was Nurul Huq from East London, who was sort of referencing the fact that at the time there were several street attacks by racists on black youth in East London. I'm using black as, at the time, that's what the activists were using, referring to the sort of the tradition at the time of political blackness across divides. So these were all the things that were involved in the making of the Black Power movement, and this is and what differentiated Black Power from the non-white organising before and after it were the following 4 components. First, culture, so both in terms of organising through cultural forms, music, arts, leisure, literature, but also in the sense that Black Power was able to shape the political culture of black communities, cultivating the soil to enable them to project their politics further than individual groups and build broader common sense around their politics. Consciousness. Black Power organisations were not cohesive or uniform, but they were made coherent by a conscious awareness of the role of black people in British society, in the world and in the grand scheme of history. It wasn't just reacting to racism, but had an ideological orientation, which was also shaped by events in Britain and worldwide. Community, so organised within and amongst communities rather than outsourcing to white-led institutions like the Labour Party or trade unions. It can be important to culture and consciousness here in creating what climate would be conducive to radical action, and self-organisation related to community organising amongst themselves with varying positions. So different organisations within Black Power had varying positions on working with white communities at the time. And this was part of the movement from a social fact to a social force, the belief that you are more than the sum parts of your collective. So this is just in reference to some of the stuff I've been talking about. So on consciousness, for movements to come into their own, they need a consciousness, ideological binding with a political orientation. So this is that sort of social factor, social force. Here's some interesting images which highlight the sort of tradition that we're talking about here. So at the top there, you've got the British Black Panther movement protest. On the right-hand side, LALCA, the Indian Workers Association of Great Britain Journal, with a focus on Vietnam. At the bottom, British Black Panther movement protest, likely against British military operation in Anguilla in 1969. And on the left there, the British Black Panther leaflet with the ex-Ghanaian president Kwame Nkrumah, pictured with their founder Obi Egbuna. And this really goes to show a few things, namely also the collaboration between Black Power movements here in Britain with solidarity struggles worldwide. So I spoke a little bit about the use of culture and the way that culture was infused into Black Power politics. The way that cultural forms were established in order to infuse Black Power politics to communities, so Notting Hill Carnival, arts, bookshops, and this allowed the consciousness and ideology to project further than individual groups and or campaigns. Parallel society, so someone mentioned Bradford 12 before. I've just got a short clip from the Mangrove 9 defence, which I'm going to play.
We've complained to the police about the police and nothing's been done. We've complained to magistrates about magistrates and nothing's been done. We've complained to judges about judges and nothing's been done. Now it's time to do something ourselves. That statement was made at the Mangrove demonstration and represents the essence of black people's experience in Britain. That since we've come here, we've suffered a long train of abuses by the police with the active knowledge and support of the British state. And those abuses have been able to be carried out under the pretext that, quote, black people are criminals, ponces, and prostitutes. That is a myth that has been created about us. That is a statement that was made by one police officer who gave evidence in the Mangrove case. Now, the demonstration that black people made against the harassment of the Mangrove restaurant, the subsequent resistance in the courts, is an active explosion of that myth.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the year 1981 specifically, because when me and Azfar were writing our book, Race to the Bottom, we focused on 1981 as a year in which the machinations of the state in order to defang Black Power movements really kicked in, and we can see the results of that today, and indeed parallels the way in which the state responded to demonstrations over recent years, whether those are climate demonstrations, Black Lives Matter demonstrations, Palestine solidarity demonstrations, and hopefully it gives us some food for thought, not only this evening, but also as we go into discussions tomorrow. So the year 1981 was the convergence point of racist law and order policing, a biting economic recession and skyrocketing unemployment, years of fascist terrorizing communities, and the passage of the racist British Nationality Act 1981. It was both a high tide and a turning point in British anti-racism, most often remembered for the uprisings that have already been mentioned in cities across the summer. But that year did not open with the defiant call to rebellion, but the piercing screams of panicked children. The night of the 17th and 18th of January 1981 took with it 13 young black lives at a birthday party in southeast London for Yvonne Ruddock and Angela Jackson, the New Cross massacre. Widely understood as the result of a racist firebombing, fitting in with a pattern in recent years of attacks against black communities in the area, the fire confirmed the very worst fears of black communities besieged by attacks and arson in Thatcher's Britain. The tragedy was immediately precipitated by a statement 2 weeks prior by Conservative MP Jill Knight, member of the far-right Monday Club, where she appeared to condone white vigilante action against West Indian parties. For the parents and peers of the killed, the pain of the incident was compounded first by the cruel intrigues of the investigating police, who tried to force out false confessions from fellow partygoers and deny racist intent to the attack, and then by the calculated indifference of the government, who made no acknowledgement of the incident for over a month. These provoked a mass response from black communities across Britain, which would culminate in the Black People's Day of Action on the 2nd of March. With 20,000 demonstrators marching across London on a weekday, the Black People's Day of Action was a physical show of defiance against those that had long assailed Black Britain, the police, the politicians, and the press. And as Layla Hassan Howe mentioned as well, that the route that was chosen for the march in and of itself was intended to go past and through all of those spaces of power, go down Fleet Street, go past Police HQ, go past Houses of Parliament. And in the months leading into the Day of Action, the New Cross Massacre Action Committee, headed by seasoned organisers Darcus Howe, John LaRose, coordinated a fact-finding mission to outmaneuver police inaction, collecting testimonies, assisting fundraising to support the families, and tackled the official smokescreen of disinformation from the state and the media. In building for the demonstration, the Action Committee toured the country, tapping into the existing infrastructure of organisations, seeing off attempts at co-option from the likes of local state relations committees. As a march to the site of the fire, attempts by some local leaders to turn into a homage to the US civil rights movement with chants of "We shall overcome" fell flat when the streets were occupied by most of the thousands in attendance. While often overshadowed by the heat and light of the uprisings later that year, the Black People's Day of Action was a zenith of self-organisation in Britain, a symbol of confidence for black communities, and a watershed moment for anti-racism from below. Enraged by this show of defiance, the Met Police struck back for revenge just a month later. Under Operation Swamp, saturation policing by uniformed and plainclothes police officers in Brixton and Lambeth resulted in mass indiscriminate stop and searches, during which 943 people were stopped over 6 days, over half of whom were black. As Layla Hassan Howe retold in 2011, everyone was talking about in Brixton. You couldn't go anywhere without being stopped. It was overwhelming, the sheer numbers of police. The name of the operation was itself steeped also in racist signifiers, consciously echoing Thatcher's infamous statement on immigration from a 78 interview, that people are really rather afraid that this country might be swamped by people with a different culture. Tellingly, local community leaders were not informed of the operation in advance, in bypassing the traditional bulwarks of moderation, and the police came up against the youth of Brixton unrestrained. It was on the 10th of April that the first anti-police rebellion broke out in Brixton, after a black man who had been stabbed was seen being loaded into a police van, and over the course of 3 days in April, the people of Brixton were in pitched battles with the police forces that had rained misery upon them for years. Brixton raised the siren that April, and the call was heeded across the country by the summer. That July, Brixton was joined by massive rebellions in Handsworth in Birmingham, Chapeltown, Leeds, Moss Side, Manchester, Hyson Green, Nottingham, Toxteth in Liverpool, during which the police deployed paramilitary tactics to quell the uprisings. Smaller skirmishes broke out in dozens of cities across the country, and in West London, Southall, mass anti-fascist clashes led by Asian youth saw the Hambra Tavern, host to a skinhead band, razed to the ground. In Bradford, the United Black Youth League prepared to defend their community from fascists. 2 weeks later, the Bradford 12 were arrested. The 81 uprisings were a deep shock to the system for the British political class. Their response rested first and foremost on repression, but also on a strategic reorientation to contain the militancy simmering in communities across the country. So in January, New Cross burned without a word from government. When Brixton was set ablaze in April, their wall of silence shattered. The first response of Thatcher's government gravitated naturally towards law and order. The role of the police in quelling the uprisings was regularly flaunted by the government, with internal briefings reserved special praise for the Special Patrol Group. Speaking in Parliament the day after the April Brixton Rebellion, Home Secretary Willie Whitelaw began with a tribute to officers' great bravery and professionalism. Meanwhile, Thatcher's meetings with community leaders after the summer riots appeared at times more like attempts to pry out a statement of support for local police. Running on a law and order ticket, the local council elections in Lambeth, the month after the uprising, saw a marked swing towards the Tories. Odes to law and order were matched indeed. Following the riots, armaments and equipments were procured for the police from the Ministry of Defence, including water cannons, rubber bullets and riot guns, battle-tested in the north of Ireland. Military camps were made available for prison overflow, while anti-rioting tactics were drawn from policing as deployed in the north of Ireland and colonial Hong Kong. The Cabinet placed serious consideration on introducing a new riot act to augment policing powers on demonstrations. Many of the legacies of the policing operation of 1981 ripple through today. During the uprising, CS gas was used for the first time against demonstrators on the British mainland in Toxteth, Liverpool, having previously only been used across the Irish Sea to quash uprisings against the British occupation there. In the Scotland Yard review of the 2011 London riots, entitled 4 Days in August, CS gas was considered as a tactic to be deployed more extensively in future unrest. A week before this recommendation was released, CS gas was thrown into the car of Anthony Granger when he was killed by police officers during an operation later found to be riddled with errors on the part of Greater Manchester Police. In 1985, a paper by the Association of Chief Police Officers, ACPO, made several references to the 81 riots, stating that they demonstrated the need for a new approach to policing disorder. As the Special Branch Project said, this new approach had three specific outcomes worth noting. Firstly, the National Reporting Centre used in the 72 miners' strike and further industrial disputes was to be placed on a more permanent footing. New training procedures for inner city disorder were created. And thirdly, the ACPO Public Manual of Tactical Operations was created and disseminated across the force. The training and handbook would provide much of the backbone of the upcoming working class rebellion against the state, the 84-85 miners' strike. Mass arrests and snatch squads became a feature of policing in 1981, with hundreds of people in Manchester arrested in relation to the uprisings. In a 1992 BBC documentary looking back at his time as Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, James Anderson summarised his strategy for the riots. When trouble arises and violence occurs, you hit it fast and hard, and that's what we did. Anderton was known by his peers as God's copper, believing the police to be a moral enforcer for his Christian faith. And he spent much of his time as Chief Constable concerned with the growing threat of unions and the potential for left-wing mobilisations. Anderton's violent response to the uprisings gained particular praise from Willie Whitelaw, describing it as a conspicuous success. He would later be protected by Thatcher after a series of public comments when he said those who had contracted AIDS were falling into a cesspit of their own making, and when he called for the reintroduction of corporal punishment the year after, saying he himself would beat criminals until they begged for mercy. His frequent public outbursts would cost him the chance to be Commissioner of the Met Police, but his peers elected him President of the Association of Chief Police Officers. He would later receive a knighthood. This was just one of the characters setting the tone of the response to the riots. But beyond ratcheting up repression, the government was forced to pivot towards securing greater consent. Central to this was a commissioning of an inquiry days after the Brixton uprisings, which was tasked with inquiring urgently into the serious disorder and report with the power to make recommendations. Lord Scarman, undeterred by his failure to effect change during his inquiry into Grunwick, was charged with this undertaking, and he would, with what would become known as the Scarman Report, published a mere 4 months after the explosion of the summer uprisings. Scarman's report was decidedly tepid. It famously proclaimed institutional racism does not exist in Britain, but racial disadvantage and its nasty associate, racial discrimination, have not yet been eliminated. His mild criticisms of the police in the lead-up to the Brixton riots served as a preamble to a report that gave them a firm stamp of approval, praising in particular praising the police's behaviour towards the riots and accepting the need for elements like plastic bullets in the course of policing. His proposed reforms centred around developing a more consultative and collaborative approach, better training for police, more diverse recruitment into police forces. And indeed, many of those sentences could be taken from reports released just this year. The government's response to the report led to the expansion of community policing strategies, incorporating community organisations as joint stakeholders in policing. I'm going to just quickly move on a little bit. So as I was mentioning in relation to the Scarman report after the Brixton uprisings and many of the recommendations that were taken, racism does not exist. Its nasty associate, racial discrimination, still persists. We need more diverse police, better recruitment to police, etc. Many of those things could be said as coming straight from the Sewell Commission or many of the inquiries that have plagued us in recent years. So shifts in policy post-1981 unravelled the radical community-based organising of Black Power. Each component that we spoke of before, consciousness, community, culture, self-organisation, was decoupled from one another and absorbed by the state, the market or the third sector through funding, professionalisation or patronage. So where there was once culture, we began to see government funding turning culture into depoliticized cultural artifacts, which were often paraded at the time on special events or occasions, etc. Consciousness turned into enabling the absorption and insertion of excluded black communities into the boundaries of Britishness, paving the way for siloed, mutually competing ethnic groups jostling over space on the agenda rather than a unified conscious movement, which saw their fate as bound with that of each other. Community organising was outsourced to non-profits, again often bankrolled at the time by local or national government of all political persuasions, inhibiting quite often the political edge and professionalising anti-racist organising, sealing it off from a community base. And self-organisation collapsed into ethnic separatism or mediated through white-led institutions turning into careerist representation politics, with individual career trajectories standing in for social progress writ large. And there's many other developments that have taken place since, a few of which I'm just going to highlight specifically from the sort of last 5-10 years, and which hopefully aid discussions both tomorrow and hopefully come out as part of our discussion as well. But over the last 5 to 10 years, we've quite often seen how this change from community to NGOs and non-profit sector has led to uncritical dependency quite often on legal rights, which can sometimes produce a tendency towards depoliticization and laws and legal processes which are often embedded within the domain of state power rather than undercutting it. In other words, a focus on rights alone keep social struggles locked within the realm of the possible, but cannot open them out onto the dreams of transformation that animated the struggles of the past. What we often find is a focus on legal struggle may ameliorate the worst excesses of state violence, but cannot undermine the system that produces them. Racist techniques of policing, say for example the introduction of facial recognition technology, can be challenged through rights-based campaigns. They can be argued against on grounds of racial discrimination or privacy rights, but rights-based organising alone cannot be used to weaken policing as an institution, nor effectively tackle the underlying conditions of exploitation that make policing a necessary instrument of the state. Quite often when we have rights-based campaigns or campaigns setting terms within the law, by focusing on framing them on rights and legalism, we can sometimes end up legitimizing unjust hierarchies when articulating claims, namely sort of searching for that perfect victim. This was something visible in the response to the Windrush scandal in Britain. Breaking headlines in 2018, the scandal found the long-settled Caribbean citizens of Commonwealth, the post-war Windrush generation, had been falsely labelled as illegal and subject to an extraordinarily brutal immigration regime, up to and including deportation to countries they had not seen in decades. While public and political consensus was rightfully outraged at the scandal, we also saw how popular framing of the issue drew upon the particular claim of the affected individuals to Britishness through their contribution of the Windrush generation to building post-war Britain. Without undermining the fundamental merit of the cause, we can trace how pleas for justice on this basis of worthiness and belonging implicitly legitimize the detention and deportation of other groups who aren't able to place themselves within Britain's national story, or to challenge the idea that they are undeserving outsiders. Black Power era campaigns, from the Mangrove 9 to the Bradford 12, quite often made creative use of legal rights alongside extra court pressure to achieve their historic wins, while groups like the Asian Youth Movement operated on a model of activist advocacy, turning cases into campaigns into causes. But defeat lingered in the wings of their victories. The legal rights they invoked were soon rolled back or written out of law by the government, and public campaigns that secured their successes faded. Their example should be upheld for the milestones that they were, but also as pertinent reminders that political power defines law, not the other way around. This is certainly not to say activists should vacate the legal sphere or ignore repressive laws or concede to the political right, least of all at a time when our rights are so comprehensively under attack. But it does speak to the need to repoliticize our framework of rights, shifting our focus out of the matrix of state power that enshrines them and into the broader struggle for popular democracy that first defined them. It means a return to mass organising as the engine of social change. In short, we need to develop a new politically robust framework within which to articulate our demands and imagine and develop new institutions to guarantee democratic freedoms. And we need to build a political culture that is able to mobilise mass popular action in defence of these broadening outwards towards the struggle of our communities, trade unions, social movements, rather than narrowing our vision to the courts or legal sphere. I think I'll end there, as I've spoken for a long time. Thank you for bearing with me, but I'm really looking forward to discussion.
Okay, so I would like to actually thank you for such an engaging topic. And before we actually move on to the question and answer, I will just add a few points. I would like to add that UK has adopted laws that address racism, including point number 1, Races Relation Act 1968. The Act expanded on 1965 Act by making it illegal to discriminate in housing, employment, and advertising. And number 2, Equality Act, which is quite famous, 2010. The Act covers race as one of the 9 protected characteristics and makes it illegal to discriminate based on race in any aspect of private, professional, related matters. It requires citizens and public bodies to consider the needs of the people with protected characteristics. Number 3, hate crime laws. The CPS is responsible for deciding which hate crime cases go to the court and increase the sentence for hate crimes. Please also note that the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was adopted in 1965 and entered into force in 1969. It remains the principal international human rights instrument, defining and at the same time, is make sure that discrimination is actually not taking place in all sectors of private and public life. I must mention that United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2142 was adopted on 26 October 1966, proclaiming 21st March as the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But still, unfortunately, we witness racism increasing by far-right characters, and I don't want to mention the names again, and we all know who they are. Recently, the United Nations General Assembly also adopted a resolution sponsored by 60 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which designated 15 March 2022 the International Day of Combat Islamophobia. So the reason was to add it because many people maybe not know about the laws. So these laws are there to protect us, even if you're Muslim or not. But still we see that it's increasing, the racism is increasing. It's a matter of concern that how we are actually going to be moving forward. Thank you.